of the true believers. And of course they might make good on their twisted ideas of ending Zionism and extending their own by other means. So this is a threat to the entire world, and it cannot be seen as anything but that.
Like our American Speaker of the House of Representatives, in Israel, Mr. Reuven Rivlin is the Speaker of the Knesset.
I really believe that Iran should be taken care by the entire family of nations, and not only by Israel. Israel has to take care and to know that one day we have to face the threat of being destroyed by possible nuclear weapon from the side of Iran. They will have to do, and we know what we have to do.
Then we asked Mr. Netanyahu about the threats Israel is experiencing from Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza.
There is a tremendous increase in the power of Iran's proxies, of Hezbollah and Hamas. We have Hezbollah now with a tremendous base, and you can see that the international guarantees that were supposed to stop the flow of arms did nothing of the kind. So we not only had 4,000 rockets fired on the Galilee from that base, but we now have 40,000 rockets, which are aimed at every part of Israel. And at the same time, the same thing has happened in the south. We've had, by the way, a tremendous increase in the power of Hamas. It actually wasn't only politically strengthened, but very shortly afterwards, it militarily just took over the Gaza Strip and kicked out the Palestinian Authority. And it's developed a base. They've rocketed 4,000 rockets, that's the number, since the unilateral disengagement. If we walk out here, there'll be an Iranian base here, right here, across this street, on the other side of the street. That's what will happen.
If you are somewhat surprised at the forceful words that Mr. Netanyahu used, you'll be amazed to learn that almost all of Israel's leaders view Iran the same way. Mr. Moshe Aarons was ambassador to the United States and served as Israel's important Minister of Defense for 3 different administrations.
The Israeli intelligence community is the #1 threat to the Jewish state of Israel. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, that's correct, because first of all, Iran is the only state, unlike terrorist organizations, but the only state in the region, in fact the only state in the world, whose government, whose prime minister, president, I guess, Ahmadinejad, openly threatens Israel and says Israel has to be wiped off the map. So here you have a declared enemy. Now Iran is not a minuscule state, and the Iranians are hell-bent on getting nuclear weapons. So when somebody is talking and working towards nuclear capability and tells you that you need to be wiped off the face of the earth, it's a real threat.
One day, as we sat on the Mount of Olives and overlooked the Temple Mount, I asked Jimmy to lay out the specific nations God reveals through the prophets will come against Israel in the last days.
Jimmy, as we look across the old city of Jerusalem and we see the Dome of the Rock, the third holiest site for the Islamic world, and you also see the Jewish Temple Mount here, which is the sacred mount of the Jewish people across the world. We see 2 opposing opinions, and it talks about the battle for Jerusalem. And I want to ask a question, and people want to know, what are the nations that are mentioned in the Bible, in prophecy, that will have a role in the end-time scenario of what happens here in Israel?
You know, John, that Dome of the Rock speaks to that group of nations, that alignment that will come against Israel, because that is a Muslim building. It's a commemorative building that Omar, one of the Muslim leaders, built there on the Temple Mount in 691 AD. But the Islamic world is what is going to basically come together, align themselves to try to destroy the Jewish state, with one exception. Russia is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel chapter 38. Here in the book of Ezekiel chapter 38, which would be the main focus in Bible prophecy. Other sections of the Bible we'll look at. But in Ezekiel 38, it talks here in verse 2 about Magog. Gog in the land of Magog. Now, Gog would be the person. Magog would be the particular state that it's talking about. And according to biblical geography, Magog would have been that land mass north of the Caspian and Black Sea, which is Russia today. Then in verse 2, it says Meshech and Tubal. And down in verse 6, it says Gomer and Togarmah. When traveling in Turkey recently, I picked up an ancient Turkish map. And in biblical times, Turkey was actually divided into 4 parts: Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarmah. So we're now talking about Russia and Turkey. There in verse 5, it says Persia. Until 1936, there were 3 nations we know today that were known as Persia. Those 3 nations are Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. And then you continue on in verse 5, Ethiopia, or Cush in some translations. That would be Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan. And then in verse 5 again, it says here in my Bible, Libya, or maybe in another translation, Put, and that's modern-day Libya, Colonel Gaddafi. You have to coordinate this with Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 to 45. It talks about the king of the north. Earlier in chapter 11, you find out that is what we know as Syria today. And the king of the south would be Egypt today. And then going over into the book of Psalm, you go over the book of Psalms chapter 83, and it talks in Psalm 83 about a list of nations. It mentions here the Ishmaelites. Well, that's modern-day Saudi Arabia. And then in verse 5, it talks about Tyre. That's modern-day Lebanon. So we're now seeing a list of Arab nations, with the exception of Russia, who will form this coalition to come against Israel in the last days.
Jimmy, when you come to Bible prophecy, what God has predicted in Scripture is absolutely mind-blowing. If people will just read it, it is so clear-cut, it is so straightforward, it jumps off the page and bites you in the foot. It's unbelievable. What God says is going to happen up ahead, the alignment of the nations that are going to come against Israel. We're seeing it, we're witnessing it in the papers every day right now. Explain a little further.
This alignment of nations will come against the nation of Israel and try to destroy the Jewish state of Israel. Ahmadinejad made the statement, Israel must be wiped off the face of the earth. We see current events unfolding that fit perfectly with the prophecies for the last days.
When will this happen?
It's going to happen when there's peace in the land. A pseudo-peace, the Antichrist sets it up when he confirms a peace treaty, Daniel 9:27. When they're dwelling safely in the land, it says in Ezekiel 38:8, when they're living in unwalled villages. In other words, that's a military term. They've laid down their weapons. Then these nations, this alignment of nations, comes to destroy the Jewish state.
This raises the question, does the Bible say that there will ever be peace in the Middle East? We will turn to that next.
All right. Get rid of this. A second, 2. Boom. Now, what they made a conclusion there that's interesting, and now I want you to turn to the first page. Get the lights, please. By the way, who was it here that gave me that DVD? Somebody, was it you folks? Thank you so much. It was just a blessing. It was great. I really appreciate you giving me that. Back to PowerPoint. And actually, I'm going to hit Psalm 83. Slideshow, home cross. I just want to read. Just want to read. 1 second.